Hello, Natroners, and welcome back to another episode of VFX with Natron. So, today we're going to be looking at doing something with the Roto Node that is actually kind of not needed in all situations, but there's times when one needs motion blur with a Roto Node, like if you're trying to do two-dimensional animation, and it doesn't actually have motion blur. And well, there's ways you can sort of fake it, and we'll go over all that in today's episode. Anyhow, I want to just give some show some examples of what today's goal is going to be, or sort of we're going to be exploring different things. There's three versions. A is a sort of this hybrid motion blur. B is a 180 degree, and C is going to be non-motion blurred. Anyway, is today's goal. As you can see, A is this hybrid motion blur, B is 180 degrees, and C is no motion blur whatsoever. And in this situation, of course, you would want motion blur, but Natron doesn't have it, and we'll discuss it. So let's go into Natron. Alright, so here we are in Natron. And of course, the first thing that we have to do is discuss why doesn't it have motion blur. Well, this was actually asked, by the way, by a person on Facebook. It was another user requested, well, it wasn't requested per se, but the person had asked the question, and it got went back and forth, and I felt like this was something that probably should be discussed with people. People could find it useful, and it's also sort of a light topic, and we haven't done a theory light topic in a while. So, let's first start off with right. We want to first add a all right. First thing we're going to do is put in a checkerboard. Why? Because checkerboards are always useful for using as a grid for aligning our roto. And we're going to make just do a simple sphere with the, circle, not sphere. Let's put a roto node in. Oh, wait a minute. I don't have my hotkeys up. One moment. Boop. We need to put that on so everybody can see what's going on here. I'll hit tab to put it in those names, just so in case somebody's new and they didn't know what I had done. I'll just hit tab, typed in roto and checkerboard. Alright, so here we go. So here we are. We've got the yellow, the center point here. We have a roto node. We're going to go up here. We're going to select out of this. We're going to pick an ellipse to start with. And I'm going to just click up here and and drag down. I was holding modifier keys. If you hold Control and Shift, you drag a circle out from its center point. I'm just dragging it out like this because I want to actually just line this up close to the center. It's fine. It's good enough. And we don't need this checkerboard anymore. So, or the checkerboard. Ugh. Let's put in a constant to replace that. Constant. That's not going to be a constant. There we go. Put that into the background. Now, there's a reason I'm putting this in. The problem with rotos is they're a draw node. And all right, let's first look at this for anybody who is not familiar. We've gone over this in the past, but right now the way that with draw nodes, what happens is whatever they draw on the screen or in your viewer is the region of definition, or as some people call it, the bounding box of the given object or thing being drawn. So in this case, it's this little square. So we're putting the constant in the background so that it matches the actual output resolution. And the reason for that is when you start animating little bits of a roto node, if you start moving them around, every now and then Natron will say, oh, this little bit either extends past the region of definition or the bounding box, or it clips some of the blur, or it will do all kinds of funky things. So it's always good if you're doing animation or something like that to put something that is going to fix your background resolution to it, unless you're doing scaling. When you get into scaling, then it gets into, you know, there's benefits, and anyway, I didn't want to go any further than that. We could spend hours talking about it. We have in the past. So we need to enable on our Roto node, and by the way, we're going to reduce this to 1, and we're going to make it so that the Roto is taking this up. So we can see that our Roto is not drawing because it's not a Roto paint. It is just a straight Roto. We're just going to enable the RGB so that it draws. And we're going to approach this from two different ways. We're going to do first, let's start off with the obvious. The obvious way to animate a roto, or the proper way to animate a roto, if we're going to try and do motion blur, is if we, for example, we have this object, this sphere or circle. I won't call it, I'm treating it as if it's 3D. It's not 3D. We're going to, you can tell that I've been playing with trying to make things 3D in Natron, and that might be a topic in the not so distant future. But right now, we have the sphere, and we have this circle, we want to move it. So we're going to do a transform node. Transform node by default is one of the types of, all right, first of all, I suppose we should go up here. Transform nodes are anything under the transform option. If you right click in your viewer, or you click over here, there's options over here, and one of them's transform, which I believe is this one right here. These are transform nodes, and most of the transform nodes, which are found in this menu right here, most of these have or many of them, I should say, that deal with movement, actual physically moving an object or moving some other element that comes before them, have motion blur options in it. So that means, like, for example, Card 3D has it. I think Corner Pin might. We're not going to go through them. I'm not going to pull it up. Crop won't, because, let's see, position probably does. I haven't actually looked. Tracker definitely does. Transform does. Transform mass does. So, you know, those are all ones that have motion blur. And we've put a transform node on here by default. We just hit T after a roto node, and we put this in here. All right, so, and we can see down here that there's a motion blur option, and all we have to do to enable the motion blur is turn it on. We're not going to do it because it slows things down while we're setting up our animation. But if we take this and we go all the way, or let's just bring this back. I'm just going to set it to minus, we're going to say 800. Oop, not 8,000, 800. There we go. So we go back 800. And it's back over here on the right. We're going to set a key. And we're not going to make this very long. I want to keep this very quick, short animation so that we get motion blur. So we're going to make it go across the screen and back. And we probably will modify this actually after we do a hand rotoed animation. So I'm actually, before we go too much further, I'm going to actually duplicate my roto because I want a version of this, and we're going to actually merge these two. Let's merge them so that we can view them together. So because I want my hand-drawn roto, and I'm going to put the I'm going to put a constant into the background for that one, because I want the hand-drawn roto to be in the center point and animate it relative to its initial position. I'm going to first let's move this one up a bit. We'll just move it up like about there, and grab the second one, and let's pull it back so that it's about the same distance. And so what we're going to do is I say, let's do this. Let's do 12 frames out. So we're going to do it half a second over to the right and then half a second back. So it's going to bounce back and forth in 1 second's time. All right. So we're going to tell it 12. We're going to move in increments of 12. We have our first frame, by the way, for this is already keyed. You can see here that it's a spline keyframe. And what spline keyframe basically means is that on the very first frame, wherever I started moving my points on a roto, those points are going to be automatically keyed at that position in time. Now, there's tricks to the Roto Node, things that you have to know. There's lots of limitations. A lot of people think that this is a regular 2D animation node, and it really isn't. This is, I've told people before, many many times. You can do 2D animation in Natron, but it's not as good as an actual, like, many of the dedicated programs. There are dedicated programs, and I actually might go over a whole bunch of open source options, because somebody had been inquiring about some doing an effect, and that would involve them. Anyway, for ours, we're going to just focus on Natron. So what is, if this is where we are, we want to go out 12 frames, so we click our move frame, or it moves us out to frame 13, which is 12 frames from frame 1. And we're going to grab this. And by the way, we're going to click on this little doodad up here, which is, instead of having to grab this in the dead center, you can see that if I click over here, it will deselect. I'm going to click on this, which will enable us, anytime we're inside of the bounding box of our selection, it will allow us to move. It'll just make it easier. And I'm going to actually, no, I think we want to, all right, this is going to bring up our first thing. How do we deal with adding and deleting keyframes here? I could delete the keyframe over here on our thing. You'll see that it says Spline Keyframe number 2. We have 2 keyframes out of 2. If I hit minus here, it will delete it, which is actually the easier way. You know what? I'm going to go out to 24 because I want to actually add a keyframe here, because I want to have it return to the exact same spot that it started. So we're going to add our second keyframe way out at frame basically 25 it is. Then we're going to go back to frame 12, which it says Spline Keyframe 1.5, and here we're going to just pull this out across the screen to about here. And now let's look at this. All right, so I'm going to change our animation from 250 frames down to 25, which should be our entire, or pretty darn close to our entire animation. And if we hit play, we can see it goes back and forth. So that is what our Roto Node does, all right? Now, that's our Roto Node animating the curve. And as we can see, there is no motion blur on that whatsoever. But if we did the same thing, if we go back here and we start off at the same spot with our actual, using a transform node, and we go out, you know, if we go out 12 frames, to there, we can pull this across, and I'm not going to worry about the Y, because the Y is going, whatever I end at is going to be the same thing. Actually, we do want to, all right, we're going to remove remove the key. We're going to go out to the end again, to frame 25. We're going to set a key there. Fine, set a key. We're just going to set a key for that dimension. Then we're going to go back 12 frames, and we're going to pull it across. There we go. All right. So the first thing, if we go back to the beginning and we stop and we hit play on these two things, we see there's a distinct difference between these two. And this is the first difference between a roto animation and using a transform. All right. The transform, as we can see, is easing as it gets to the end. It slows down and stops. So we want it to mimic, let's get them to mimic each other so that everything's on the exact same page. We're going to, if we fit our curve, we can see here's the problem. This is why it isn't. This is easing, which is a desirable thing most of the time. So we're going to right click on this, and we're going to change the interpolation to linear, so that now they should move pretty much identical. So we can already tell that by default, rotos work off of linear animation. You say, aha, okay, so let's try and make do the first thing that most people are going to think is that they don't want it to be linear. How do you make something not linear with roto? Well, if we select the roto, actually select it and bring up its properties, make sure we have the actual curve that we're going to be animating. I could just have to close a view here. I don't want something, it's distracting me over here. We don't want, we have the ellipse selected. If I look at the actual spline curves for this and select this animation curve, if we look at this, we can see it doesn't look like the other animation. In fact, it isn't anything like our other animation. All we have here is a list, basically, of keyframes over time. We are saying that at this point in time, I am at keyframe number 1.5, basically, or keyframe number 1, okay? And then out here, I'm at keyframe number 2, which is, you can see that it's not. It's like, all right, let's go back to the beginning. So this says that it's keyframe 1, right? Well, we can see that it's actually 0 on this dot here. This is actually the keyframe. If we go out 1, we're actually, it says here, we're at spline keyframe number 2. And you can see, and then we go out one more, and we're at spline keyframe number 3. And we can see it all represented here, and it's actually 0, 1, and 2. That's how it's represented. So, and the thing is if we can't do anything, we can't actually make this ease here. So this is one of the reasons that I tell people, when you work with animation, when you do animation with rotos, it's really not advised, because you have to manually do your easing. So in order to ease this, if I wanted to ease this keyframe, what I would have to do is I'd have to go, back to the point where I want it to ease, and then I'd have to figure out, okay, well, where do I want it relative to, where it should be. Let's see. So we're coming over here, we're going over, we'd have to put a keyframe here, and let's see. Well, I could, sort of pull it this way and say I want it there, and you can see it just added a keyframe and it pulled it down and it made it weird. But what you're seeing here is that in time, what it did is it created this zigzag, and the reason is that this zigzag is actually, this is the distance between 1 and 2. So this is why it zigzagged, is it's showing that this is keyframe number 2 is here in time, keyframe number 1 is here. So this is sort of my ease right here. So I can use this to visualize my ease, for example. So I can say, okay, well, I think I want to ease it a little bit more, maybe. It's not really our ease. Actually, it's not actually showing us any time reference now that I'm thinking about it. You can't even use it for that. But you could do that. There was another software you could do that in. Oh well. Anyway, you can see. So I've slowed it down at the end there. See, it comes in and then it eases, and then it goes off in the other direction. So we can sort of ease it by adding keyframes. Well, we really don't want to do that at this point. I want to keep it linear. All right, so now let's go back to the transform node. To add motion blur to this, on top of this, all we have to do is give it a motion blur of 0.01, and lo and behold, when we hit play, that has motion blur by default. Well, what about our circle down here? Our circle does not have motion blur. All right, well, how do we, this is our roto. How do we add it? Well, we would think, let's look through our options here. We don't have to look very far, because it usually would be found on transform. This is usually where you would find motion blur options, but as we can see, there is no motion blur here. None of these are motion blur, not even these extra modifiers, as far as I know. If I'm wrong, please tell me, somebody can write to me, but I went through them, I never found motion blur in any of these. So we look in here, nope, nothing there, nope, no, I don't see motion blur, don't see motion blur. Nope, no motion blur there. We do have feathering. Now, okay, that raises a point. Feathering. Well, we could, if we were manually, the idea behind Roto is to create a Roto stands for rotoscope. Usually what rotoscope means is that you're tracing around something that exists. It's designed for creating masks on objects, things that exist in video. And so linear keyframing is useful in that type of situation, because you don't want you to get spline interpolation. You want your points to follow exactly where you, as the person rotoing, put them. And that's, there's people who would argue that, but there's good reason to keep it linear. Is a safe bet that it will follow it. So if the thing you're tracking has motion blur, well, how would you follow that motion blur inside of a roto? Well, when we select a point here, we can see these little dongles or little hanging bits here. Those are actually that's actually feathering on it, and Natron has this option where we can pull off of it and create feathering by just pulling stuff off. And so what we could do in theory is we could create a blur or simulate this quote motion blur by simply putting this in here as it moves. But the problem we face is, of course, we'd have to do that for the whole animation or at some point in the animation. So we just created a keyframe here, and that's not necessarily where I'd want it. So I got to go back here to my animation and I say, oh, I didn't want that keyframe there. Let's get rid of it. And it should, if everything worked right, yeah, reset our animation. So let's figure out, if we go back here to the beginning and we change this from 12 to 6, let's try doing that. Let's go 6 frames forward to the midpoint. That should bring us out here. And as you can see, we're suffering from lag because of the motion blur redrawing. Let's drop that motion blur off for the moment. Actually, no, we're going to use it as our reference for how big this should be. All right, let's go back here, grab our ellipse and pull this out just a smidge and pull this out on this direction just a smidge and sort of say, okay, well, there's our motion blur. And let's just say that's good enough for this point in time. All right, and then we'll go, we're going to tell it 12 frames from now. Let's go forward. And yes, that should have created a keyframe there. I didn't see it do a keyframe. All right. Well, here we're going to pull it out, create a keyframe there, and create a keyframe behind it. And you can see this doesn't line up, by the way. We can see that the edge here, the original edge, lines up with the back side of this. And the front edge here actually would be further along. And the reason that it looks like this is this has what's called 180, well, this has true motion blur, where it's averaging all these frames together. All right, so how does this look? Let's compare the two. Now, I'm going to, I think I might just drop the resolution just a smidge. Hopefully our motion blur, this will register fairly quick. And we can see that, okay, we get something that kind of looks like motion blur here, but it doesn't really. It looks like something is growing and then fading, and it really doesn't. We'd have to hand animate this, and if this is a 2D animation, this wouldn't be ideal. So we can see that the top sphere, or excuse me, the top circle has motion blur in it that looks proper or for the speed that it's going, whereas the bottom one looks really funky and off. So we don't have motion blur, and obviously hand animating, we could go ahead and hand animate the entire thing and try and pull the feathering out and do whatever. And if you were actually rotoscoping, that would make sense because you're following the motion blur of whatever's there, whatever you're rotoscoping. You want to follow that and add the feathering to it so that you try to make it sort of transparent. And it gets tricky. You want to actually, it works better with green screens than it does with green and blue screens than it does with live action, where there's actually details behind it, because then those things affect the transparency and you get into really funkiness. Anyway, so what's our next option? Well, all right, first of all, let's get rid of those 2 points here because we don't want them anymore. We want to be back to just having a nice sphere. How can we add, let's first of all get rid of that motion blur again. And how can we add motion blur to this Roto Node, this sphere, without adding the way we've animated it here? Is there a way we can do it? Well, the answer is yes, there is a way, but it's not easy. It's a little bit long-winded and tricky. And while this isn't an ideal situation, I'm going to show you a situation in a few minutes where we're going to replace this and do the exact same thing, where this option where we could use a transform node just simply won't work. But we're going to use our transform node to show how we get a 180-degree motion blur, a perfect 180, because we're going to compare it to the actual motion blur right here to prove that it's a 180-degree motion blur. All right, so how do we go about this? All right, the first thing we have to do, we have to use a method called frame blending, okay? And to frame, what frame blending is it's basically, it looks at a whole bunch of frames and it averages all these frames together to create a new image. Let's take a look at that node. Let's hit frame blend. All right, we have frame blend, and there we go. We can see by default when we click on frame blend, it says frame range -5 to 0. All right, well, that's the first thing that we have to change. The first thing we need to do is we need to change this because we don't want this from behind. We already saw when we had motion blur on the real one, it started from the frame that it's on, which means that the first frame is going to be frame 0, which means our frame, and then it's however many frames beyond this that we want to average. So what we need to do in this situation is in order to create this, we don't have any frames between this frame and the next frame. All right. If we turn on real motion blur, even at let's reduce this down to 4 so that we're looking at this at even a lower resolution, so this updates much faster. All right, so we're looking here. We can see frame 0 is here. In the motion blur, this edge lines up with this back edge of the circle. And this is, by the way, we're sweeping back in this direction. It doesn't matter if we were going in the forward, we're lined up with the back edge because the motion is going across the screen this way. So this side needs to move this direction. So what we want to do with this frame blend, let's see if we just take it up one frame and see what happens. And we can see that just adding one frame of frame blending pushes this, the two together just go beyond the end of where this is. And the reason that that's happening is that if we look back at the actual motion blur, it says that the shutter angle is 0.5, which means it's 180 degrees. It's half of whatever the distance between the first the keyframe we're on and the next keyframe is. It's only motion blurring half of that distance, which means that the transform is taking place from the center point of this one to the center point of that one, as opposed to the entire difference. Oh, distance. It's going half of that distance. So it's basically, it's moving from here to about right where my cursor is where the center of it is, which means the rear edge starts off here and ends somewhere about here, and the far edge starts off right about here and moves about halfway out to the center point of the other, and or where the far edge is. It moves about halfway between the center point and the far edge is where that ends. So if we were to take this motion blur, the shutter angle, and set it to 1, we can actually make it, that means it's doing from one frame, it's doing it's moving the entire distance, all right? But that looks really bad. It looks really, really bad if you were to actually do it. In motion pictures, when you do 24 frames a second or anything, you should really be using a 180 degree most of the time. There are exceptions to this. Action cameras, for example, when you're doing really high speed sports photography, you don't do they don't usually use 180 degree rule. They usually try and clip it as fast as physically possible because they want to stop that action so that you can see it, so you can see every single nuance in what's going on, so when they review it in slow motion you can see it, as opposed to seeing a blurry mush of whatever was in front of the camera. But to get motion to look smooth, continuous, you want to give it 180 degrees. So we're after this 0.5 frame blur, but we can't do that with by just having 1 or 2 frames. What we need to do is increase our frame count. All right, how do we do this? Well, we first have to ask ourselves, how many frames of blur are we going to have to combine, or how many frames together are we going to have to combine to make this look like it's an actual blur? Well, that's where things get tricky, because then it's hard to say, but my rule of thumb is the easiest way to do it is to simply take whatever your animation length is and add 10 frames. Why? Because it's a simple multiple. We work off of a decimal system. So if I have 25 frames, I happen to know that all I have to do is we're doing 24 frames a second, right? Well, let's find out. We need to bring up our properties. We're doing 24 frames a second. We have 250 frames. Why is it 250 frames? Well, because we're actually starting off on frame 1, which means that we have to we're offset by we're offset by basically 1 frame, which, believe it or not, over the course of 250 frames means that at the end of it we're actually off, or we're, well, it gets into complicated. We're actually going to make our final animation in the future is going to be probably 260 frames, for the reason that it actually is a smoother, it's going to be smoother for our final animation. But for our purposes, what we need to do, we're just dealing with 1 second's worth of animation. And so we need to basically take our animation and stretch it out by 10 times whatever it is. Well, how do we do that? Well, we simply go out to frame. If I know my last frame, if I go here to the last frame, hold on. If we go to our last frame and say it's 25, I can just simply go out here and say I want this to be 250. All right, I put my time frame. Now I've moved my time way the heck out. You can see that we're way the heck out there with frame 250. All right, and by the way, we're going to just zoom in here back to 25. And what we're going to do is go to the curve editor, select that animation, and we can see this is our playhead for this is where our playhead is, and these are our frames. If I select these frames and drag around them like so, you can see it puts a box around it. And if I grab that box, I can grab that box, and if I grab it from the center, I can move those frames so that I can offset my animation time, which is not what I want to do. So I'm going to hit undo. If I grab the end of it, however, you can see that I stretch it. I can stretch my animation. All right, that's good. Except for, as we saw, as I stretched it in one direction, it stretched in the opposite. So that's not obviously what we want either. And it looks like it didn't actually reset us to frame 1. That's weird. I want to make sure that our animation here starts on frame 1. So let's get that back to frame 1. All right, so there's frame 1. Let's zoom out so that we can see it. And by the way, if you're ever curious, if you zoom in like this, you'll notice that it's zooming uniformly on the curve graph, or on our graph. If you hold down Control, it zooms horizontally, and I think if you hold Control and Shift, it zooms vertically. So if we zoom this vertically like so, and then horizontally like so, it allows us the better ability to see where we're going, because we want to take this from where it is and stretch it out so that it matches up with this line here, which is our end time. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to hold down the Shift key. All right, the Shift modifier, and if we click on the end here and pull on it, now we're pulling that out, and we're going to just pull it out and try and line it up right on that time. And we can zoom in here and see if we really got it in close, and we can see we're actually off by a frame, or it looks like we're off by a frame. So let's zoom in a smidge and let's fit that actually. And then we're going to what I think I want to do is shrink this down vertically so that I can zoom in quite a ways and get right in there. And then I'm going to hold down Shift again, and I'm going to pull that out so it's right on top of it. So there we go. So now I've made this entire animation for the Roto animation, or the bottom one. If we hit play now, we can see that it's barely moving at all. It's not moving very much at all. All right, so back here on frame 1, what this tells us, though, we still have motion blur on the one above it, and it's because it's linear. It's a perfect 180 degree. It's going exactly, there's no speeding up, so we know that this is moving consistently, so we're getting a perfect representation of that time. So what does this mean? Well, this allows us to tell how many frame blend frames do we need to get out to that halfway point. Well, it's pretty easy actually. We can just sit here. We don't even need. We can close this down. We can pull up our frame blend, and if we look at this, and we tell it that we want our last frame, what we're going to do is just increase this number until they match, basically. And you'll notice that when we get up to 5 frames, they match. So this tells us that we told it we wanted 10 frames between each frame. But to get 180-degree shutter, what we did is we have to take half of that. So the last frame is going to be 5. So this means that right now we have enough frames, but it's not quite as clean as the other one. And we can see that it's not cleaned at all. And in fact, well, that actually is partially due to the fact that we're looking at it at a reduced resolution. But we can see we have hard lines here. And so it's not ideal. This is still not ideal. In order to get this ideal, what we would have to do is increase this even more so that we could get more frames in it. So if we say that whatever we increase it by, if we take half of that, we'll get our 180-degree shutter. Well, this is one way we can do it. There's another way we can do this motion blur, which is using an interval-based one, where we say, okay, well, we know that to get our full 360-degree shutter angle, which means it goes from the first frame to the next frame. All we have to do is set this to however many frames we have. So if I set that to 10 frames, well, we get more detail here, but it's stretched out. Well, one of the things that's interesting about this is we can actually change this so that we can dial it back with this decay. So if we increase our decay, what we start seeing is something really interesting happening as we start taking advantage of what's called trailing. This is a different type. We're favoring the last frame of this. And some people like this method, some people don't. But the key reason that this is potentially useful, and I often, when you try to do this, this can be a beneficial thing, is because you actually end up with more frames of in between when you get more options or more bits to use, and it also transitions a little bit softer. So we can, when we get up to about 5 for our decay, we can see we actually wind up with something that looks almost like a 180-degree shutter angle here, but it's favored in a different point. And this can appeal to some people. It doesn't appeal to other people, but it's the cheapest way to do this. It's a lot less expensive, especially if we get into more complex animation. But does it look as good? Well, let's take a look. The problem, let's first of all, we need to address something. Let's go back and put this back to a perfect 180 degree. Let's set our thing to 5 frames. All right. And the problem is right now, if we move forward to frame, 5, we can see that we're way behind. Well, we need to we need to retime our entire animation now because we've slowed it down by 10 times as much. So what we need to do is put a retime node in here. Retime. And we put this retime node in, and we tell it that we want this to be now, however many frames we've added or added to in between, we need to tell it that we want that many frames in addition to it. So we say that we want this animation to play, instead of 1 to 1, we want it to be 10 times faster. And by telling it we want it to be 10 times faster, now this should be, in theory, the same speed from end to end. So if we hit play, actually you know what, we're going to let it go. It should be darn close. If it's not, it means that our frames weren't quite lined up. Actually, it looks like I might have been off by a frame on my. I think I know why it looks off to us. I think if we go back to our animation, we may find that this keyframe here is not on frame 12 or 11. Wait, hold on. Let's go 12 frames forward. Frame 13. So where is... Oh, it's not. Oh, we've already stretched it out. Foo. This creates a problem. All right. Is this on frame 130? No, it is not. It's at frame 125-ish. We can see that it's off. So, let's see. I think this could be part of our problem. Let's pull this out to frame. It says here we want to go. It won't let us put it exactly at frame 130. Well, we'll try there. Let's see if that works. Nope, that's not working. I was off in my initial, according to this, I was off in my initial position, potentially. Which means that we have a problem here. All right, let us shrink this all back down. Let's shrink this back down for the moment. Let's disable these. I want to disable these because this shows the next problem is if your animation is not spot on and you need to do retiming, you have to actually shrink it back down to whatever the original timing was. So we want to actually bring this out to frame 25, and we want to hold down shift and pull this out, get that onto frame. Let's shrink that, get this in here and get it right on top like so. And then we're going to go here to that other one and look at it. That should have been on at frame 13, and it's not even, I can't even get it there. We're going to have to delete and rebuild that point. All right, what just happened? Uh-oh, whoops. Is that right? Hold on, fit. There we go. All right, so we delete that one point, and we can see that we need to go out to frame 13. We need to grab this. We need to pull this out across here, which is fine. We want it to be approximately there, which should be the last frame. The problem we have here is that, let's just disable that. Oh, not disable. We want to, pardon? We want to go to our motion blur, turn it off temporarily. Let's line those up a little bit better. Make sure we got that. All right, we want our roto. Select that. Pull that over a little bit. Just try and get it as close as possible. Anyway, we actually were seeing what we wanted to see. For the most part, it doesn't matter. Let's go out again. We want to go out to 250, and we want to take this, and we want to again zoom this in, pull this out to there, zoom in a lot, hold down our shift, bring that out like so, and it's should be good. Let's see that. There we go. Grab that, pull that out, just get it right on top there. So there we go. All right, so hopefully that center point should be around 130. Now it's saying it's at 125. All right, well, it doesn't matter. We're gonna re-enable these, and we still get to see that we have, using this method, if we enable all of this, shutter angle 0.5, that's weird. There we go. We should see that we have indeed 180 degree shutter. So now, so here's 180 degree shutter done the same way. They're both done basically. We've got 180. It's looking a little off here, and I have a feeling that it might be, the timing might be a little off, but it's looking pretty darn close. We're getting basically 180 degree shutter between the two. Which makes me wonder, did I mess up my curve, perhaps? Oh no, that's the wrong thing. That would be it's transform node. Anyway, we can see that it's working, but it's offset. It's definitely offset a little bit. Well, it didn't do this offset earlier today when I did my earlier test, so I can't help it. So it still doesn't change the point. We're just the only reason this is off is because our timing is off, and I have a feeling that we may have wanted to put this, as I say, at 260 as opposed to. I think our actual animation might have needed to be 260 to work properly, but that's besides the point. We're seeing what we need to see, which is that we're getting basically the equivalent of 180 degree shutter angle using this. Now, if we wanted to increase this, if we wanted to increase the detail further, as I said, we would have to go to the end here and for our, oh, wait, we're on our transform node again, back to our roto, to our curve. By the way, I want to also point out that the animation keys, you'll notice they don't appear in our dope sheet. There is no way to do this. The only way to deal with animation keys for Roto Node is inside of the graph editor. But it's not a big deal because these are literally physical keyframes. We're looking at physical keyframes and where they appear in time. And you really can't push these up and down. As far as I know, you can't. Actually never actually tried. No, you can't actually move those up and down. You can only stretch them out in time. So if we wanted to add more frames to this, if we wanted to make this blur a little bit better, what we would have to do is we would have to stretch this out further in time. How do we do that? Well, we take this, we said we were at 250. Well, if we go to 500, let's add 500. That will mean we're doing 20 frames of motion blur. So then I can sit here and I can hold down my shift key, drag this out, zoom in on frame 500, zoom in, make sure that we're zoomed correctly, get that nice and right at spot on. That's close enough that for our purposes. And we tell it that instead of the retime node being 10, we're going to set it to 20. And now, what I find fascinating here is that it's not showing us a motion blur on the first frame. We really should have motion blur here, and it's not showing it, which is weird. All right, well, we got it now. All right, so our frame. All right. Oh, of course. We've doubled it. Right. We doubled the frames. So now 5 is not the proper count for how many frames we need for our in-betweens. We've doubled it. So we're now dealing with 20, so we need half of 20, which would be 10 frames. So if we do 10 frames, now we've got a 180 degree frame thing, and we can see that now it's a lot cleaner, and we wind up with a lot better thing. But we're making it a lot beefier, and it's taking up a lot more time to do this. And then if we ever have to fix our animation, it's a pain. So what I recommend doing, this is just if you're going to do this, what I highly recommend doing is to duplicate. Basically, take your Roto Node and just hit Alt-C and copy it so that you get your final animation. And so that will allow you to, and then you can stretch it, and that way you keep a copy basically, or you keep your original animation so that if you decide, oh, you know what, I don't like the way that's moving over there, you don't have to basically stretch everything back like we've been doing. You have a copy that was kept at in its original state, so all you have to do is restretch it at the end and get it up to however many frames of motion blur you want. So okay, but you say to yourself, well, Bill, this is a problem, you know, this is weird. Why would I not just use a transform node in every situation? It just makes sense. We saw it works. Why would we not? Well, I'm going to pull over something that's a pre-made. I've made it a animation. I'm going to copy it and I'm going to paste it in here, and we're going to look at this. All right, let's just hop over to this. All right. So this animation, if I pull this up and select our thing, we can see this animation is 13 frames long, which means it's exactly 12 frames. It starts and ends. So what we're going to do is just at this point set this to 12 frame or excuse me, 13 frames so that we can watch this. And we're going to hit play. And we can see what this is basically a simple wave animation. And I've hand animated this. And I'm not going to go through this because this is beyond the scope of this. We're talking about motion blur here. We can see that what I did is on the frame out this on my first frame. First of all, let's look at our first and our last frame. If we go to our first frame, we have this. Our last frame, it's the exact same basic pose. If we go forward one on the first frame, we can see what I did is I did a little bit of easing here. What I had the fingers sort of twist as it moved away. I had the fingers lag behind to give it a little bit of what's called secondary animation. Then at frame 5, I brought it to the midpoint. I still had the fingers lagging behind. I have them lagging behind here, and then they catch up at the end. And then they go back, they lag behind, and then they, on the return, they're lagging behind in the opposite direction, lagging behind, and then they catch up, and then they stay caught up, and then they lag behind, and so on. And so what it creates is this look of a hand waving. All right, that's all it is. It's pretty simple. I animated it in pretty much the way we saw, but as we can see here, this looks terrible as it is. Well, gee, I mean, from a motion standpoint, if you start doing this, it's impossible to define or to identify those individual fingers. And unfortunate thing is for this type of thing, which is two-dimensional animation, and as I said, for two-dimensional animation, this is terrible. Now, if we had done this as segmented as opposed to curve animation, we could have, put, transform nodes and waved it that way and achieved it. But this is actually being, I've animated an actual physical curve. I've animated this ellipse. I added points in, I pulled those points around, and I did my roto animation. And now I want to add motion blur. And there is, as we know, there's no way to do this other than hand animating it. I could hand animate the feathering. That could work. But what a pain in the butt. We already went through that with just the steer. It wasn't working easily. So we can use this same technique. So if I take this, we already said that this was set to, we already know what this is. And I have this already timed out. I already told you that I don't want to work on my master animation. I want to work off a copy. So I'm going to copy this. That's the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to copy my animation. Then I'm going to, for the sake of saving us all this time of rebuilding our 180-degree shutter, I'm going to throw this in like so and put this on here like that. And you're saying to yourself, wait a minute, Poirot Bill, that's not brought out in time. Well, we need to double click on this Roto Node to set it up. And by the way, I need to, for the background, actually, let's not put that constant in there at this point, because we're probably going to see some artifacts on this particular thing when we start doing the motion blur. I want us to see that so people understand that ROD a little bit better. We can see the ROD or the bounding box of our animation. It changes with every single frame. Actually, it's not changing anymore because we've retimed this entire thing. But for the moment, let's disable that. If we go back in time and we look at this, we can see our bounding box around this is changing all over the place, and that is actually the reason that you don't want to use the bounding box of your object, because when it changes, when it starts blending those frames together, it's going to, if one bounding box, it's going to average all the bounding boxes together to make it. So if one of those bounding boxes doesn't envelop the next frame, that means a piece of it, of the next frame, might get chopped off or might be exist in the future, so to speak. So it's really a weird concept to think about. You're averaging all of the bounding boxes together. And so we're going to see this in a minute. And it's the reason we put the constant behind it. All right, so let's go over. We're going to select our animation. And as you can see, this animation, if we fit it, is zigzaggy because I've added its offset. It's not zigzaggy because I'm doing timing. Well, it is zigzaggy because I'm doing timing. It's zigzaggy like this because the first keyframe, you'll notice that this is a completely linear progression. Every one of these dots is one dot higher or one number higher vertically than the previous one. The reason they look offset and so forth is because the timing is how far away they are in time from one keyframe to another. It has nothing to do with the timing other than that. Or the look of the animation other than that. That's where my keyframes are. So, all right, we need to go out. Now, I happen to know to do this, I need to, for 13 frames, I need to go out to get this out to the point I want to go out to frame 260. It just happens to be a perfect multiple. If we take this, brought it up to 130, we're dealing with 20 frames of in-betweens. So if this is 13 times 20 is 260. So we want to go out to frame 260. That's where our last frame is going to be. All right. So we can see it way the heck out there, which is beyond the end of our actual animation, by the way. Our animation ends at this is the last frame that Natron sees at the project level. We're actually past it. It's not a problem. Do not worry about that. We can go beyond the end of the project. But what we do want to do is grab this and pull on this. So we're going to pull those keyframes out. Let's keep pulling those out. Let's pull those all the way out. Keep going way out here, holding shift. Remember, I'm holding shift as I do this to keep that first frame locked at the beginning. I'm going to just bring this out and just try to line that right up on top of that. And I might be a little bit off, but it doesn't matter. You can see that's frame 259, that's frame 260. I'm so close, and that this should not affect anything. So there we go. There's our retimed animation. And so now if we look at our animation, it's really, 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 really slow, and we can see we hit play and it just barely does anything. So then we take our frame blends. All right. So here, this is already set up. We said that we're going to use 10 frames of blending. Let's take actually, we can see it here. We're going to, when we re-enable the frame blend, we can actually see our 180 degree motion blur start. So here it is. That's our 180 degrees. And then we take our retime node and we enable that, and we should now get our entire animation. And it's still looking funny. That's weird. Our retime node is... This is very weird. We're getting a weird result. We should be getting... Let's get rid of that and do a retime. Retime. There we go. There we go. Take that, say 20 times. All right. And so this should be... We've got a real problem here, Houston. Natron's doing something funky. All right, now it's not. All right, so, well, all right. There you go. That was an issue related to the bounding box. As soon as we plop it into the constant, it fixed the problem. So we can see that you need a constant if you're going to do 2D animation behind it to make this work. All right, so there's 180 degrees. So let's take a look at this from the beginning, and let's animate it and watch it. And now we have a full 180 degree shutter angle applied with 20 we have 10 frames of motion blur, but we're using 20 frames to get it. And we can see. Now, here's some things that I'm not particularly fond about this, is that the motion blur, we can see here, it's pretty darn linear. It's really, when I say it's linear as in it's moving from frame to frame perfectly between these things. And so we wind up with these hard edges. And to me, I don't know. I don't like these, like, we can see our original was not, was not squarish looking fingers. To me, this is a personal thing. I think if we go back to our frame blend, if we switch this back up, let's change this so that we're using 20 and change it so that instead of change the decay up to say 0.5. I actually, in some ways, think this has a much more or something in here. We may even if we took it down to say 0.3 and kept that at like 10 frames of motion blur, there is this retains more of our original shape, and to me that to me helps. I mean, it's a trade-off. The question is, do you want to preserve? This isn't truly 180 degree. It is a motion blur. We have a motion blur here. And in fact, we do have a little bit of motion blur on the opposite side, because that's what the decay basically is, a shift. It's where this is occurring between 0, which is 100 or whatever our shutter angle is, and basically the being completely one is basically it's our last frame, but we don't, it's pointless at this point. We have no motion blur here. But I usually say somewhere between, somewhere in here, we want to have it to get it. And I find 0.5 usually works pretty darn well most of the time. But you might want to drop it down to make it more visible. I think somebody pointed out that they weren't crazy about it because they thought it looked slow when I showed this to some people. So let's look at it. I've plopped down at 0.3. And we can see that here we go. And by the way, and this is using we're averaging the frames together to get this kind of motion blur. And you can see that there is blur happening here, and that motion, as we can see, reads a lot better. We can see that it's fingers moving back and that it's actually a wave. We can constantly identify the fingertips. And that's one of the things that if we were to compare this to the original, and the way we're going to do this, let's pop the original in there. What we're going to do is take the original, put a transform node after it. We're going to merge and put this, put the original. All right, let's offset the original minus, I don't know, like 400. There we go. Maybe a little further, 500. There we go. All right, so now we can, if we rewind this and watch this, and we can see that this is really hard to identify those fingers. If we look at them, it's hard to tell. I mean, can tell from the arm movement that this is a wave, but here we can actually almost watch the fingers, the individual fingers, as they're moving, whereas here it's unknown what's going on here. And so in some ways this is a more appealing movement for the overall finger movement, as opposed to doing a true 180 degree shutter. But you know what, everybody has their own preference. So let's put it back to a true 180 and look at that and play with that and look at it and see if that reads. We definitely can read them, but to me, if you actually happen to glimpse at it between frames, it looks like there's hard tops. You can see, like, it looks like it looks very boxy at the very top. So it's not, in some ways, from a visual standpoint, it may not be as appealing. So these are decisions that people have to make when using this, and I wanted to show those because it's very important that this, you should be aware what the trade-offs are. This gives us a boxy thing, whereas if we take that decay up a little bit, we wind up with something that's not maybe as motion blurred as it was before, but it is. And by the way, we can also, if we find that we want more blur to it, we can actually increase the amount of frames. And mind you, this offsets it because it's going to bring it, it's going to favor the last frame, or the end of the animation more so if we bring this up. So if I bring this up to say 20, now I've got more frames being used in the decay. We can see here, I can bring it down even to 2. There we go. We still have motion blur, but we have identifiable fingers now, much more identifiable fingers. And let's hit play here. And let's watch that. This is probably going to look off to some people, but it gives us another type. This is more of a ghosting type of motion blur, but ghosting motion blur can actually be just as useful. And I don't know if people noticed it there at the end, because we got to the end and we're basically, it stops. There is no animation after that. So know that if you want to blend beyond, you may have to do keyframes beyond your animation and add them in. But we can see that also reads. Does it read better? Well, I think that reads better than this does. Does it read better than 180 degrees? These are questions people have to ask. These are things that you want to know. We're using all 20 frames this time to do it, or blending with all 20. And in some ways, that is a more effective motion blur, and we don't wind up with the same type of artifacts that we wound up with on the other, with the blocky style. So again, this was all about evaluating this and in deciding, you know, in understanding it, and understanding there is a way of getting motion blur. And this isn't limited to using for just, we used this technique actually a long time back when we wanted to do motion blur for fire. When we were doing a background, we had done Natron burning, and we had a shader toy node, and we wanted to do that. We basically stretched out the animation and did this, a very similar thing. But a lot of people may not have realized we didn't go into a lot of the details behind, you know, why we might do it and what the advantages of one thing are versus another. And the whole point of this is, some of these things, this is again theory. This was a theory episode, so we could look at, you know, and evaluate what works, what do I like, what don't I like, what are the pros, what are the cons, does one for this situation work better? In my personal opinion, because I you know, if this was a shape I wanted to keep, I in some ways prefer this method over the 180 degree, but a lot of people like the 180 degree, and I question, it was really funny, I presented this to a couple gamers, and the gamers actually preferred this, have not understanding the 180 degree shutter rule, whereas a lot of people who have motion graphic backgrounds say, oh, that's 180 degree, that's the proper thing. To each their own. So anyway, today's goal was this. And by the way, I want to point out, if I let this go, it's going to keep going on and on and on, and will never stop. This is a 100% looping animation. If you set the if I were to set those 13 frames. Oh, I didn't. I'm going to pop back. There's one other thing I didn't show. That is very important. This creates a problem. A lot of people are going to be like, wait a minute, Power Bill, how did you get, you know, that to loop continuously over and over and over again? Because that would mean you have to keyframe it, keyframe it, keyframe it, keyframe it all until the end of the animation. If I set this, oh, I'm glad I thought of this. Let's set this out to our frames out to 260 frames, and then let's pull up our project and change this from 250 to 260 so that it matches what the actual final project was there. And let's watch what happens. If we hit play here, it does one loop and then it stops. And you think to yourself, oh my gosh, I've got to go back and I've got to reproduce it. But the problem is you can't copy those frames from earlier to later. So how do you create a loop? Because obviously I did. There's another node for that. It's actually a one of the community plugins. If we go into our community plugins here and we go down to time, we'll see this thing called time loop. And if you tell it if you click on time loop, it plops it in first. It puts it in incorrectly, but we can plop it in here, put this in here. And what you have to do is you have to tell it how many frames were, first of all, you tell it how many frames or what your starting frame is. Our starting frame was frame 1. How long is the loop itself? Well, we know our loop was 13 frames. As soon as we tell it those two parameters, now if we go back to the beginning and hit play, lo and behold, watch what's going to happen. We wind up with a perfectly looping animation forever and a day. So that is how you can do it. And the way you would transition between things in Natron is you would basically create another, I mean, I'm going to be honest here. If you're doing multiple animations, multiple movements, it's almost better to take your roto. You can do a single animation, but what I would recommend is do your animation to one thing, and if you want to get to a loop, simply break out a second copy of it to do the looped section. Tell it the starting point of where the loop starts, the end point of the loop, and just loop it at that point. Remember, this doesn't have to look at any given piece. And then what you do is you edit it together. That's how you actually would animate 2D animation inside of Natron, and how you can get these loops and things like that using this technique, because I don't want people thinking that, oh my gosh, I'd have to, do loopy bits in other ways. And you can actually, if you set up these things right, where you have transitions, where you basically take a base pose for any motion that you want. Like, for example, if you were having a character, pirate build character, who's sitting there and talks with their hands a lot, they could talk with their hands. So you could have a generic position where they have their hands in front of them, something like this, and then you could sit there and have them go, and then like, and this, and that, and then, so that when you do gestures and stuff, it goes from it. Or you could have them start off frame, so it comes up. Anyway, I was just saying, you can do them as multiple rotos. Just thoughts. Throwing that out there for people who might be thinking of this from a 2D animation standpoint. I'm trying to help people. Hopefully I've not overwhelmed too many people. Right. So again, today's goal was this. I think we accomplished it. So thanks for watching. Keep on Natroning. Whoops.